We want to go through with you what is human rights due diligence and what it means for palm oil companies. Let's start by looking at why human rights due diligence. Expectations that companies respect human rights in business operations and their supply chains has been coming from civil society organizations, customers, and increasingly investors and governments. There is a trend of governments passing legislation requiring companies for mandatory human rights due diligence in their businesses and supply chains. This is the case of several European countries like France, the Netherlands, and Germany, as well as at the regional level of the European Union, which is drafting a mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence directory. There are also several studies describing the business case for respecting human rights, with benefits ranging from lower long-term costs, higher staff retention, increased productivity, and broader pool of talents linked to increased diversity to enhance social license to operate. What human rights due diligence offers companies is a systematic approach to respecting human rights. It allows companies to proactively identify, address, prevent, mitigate, and remediate human rights abuses, such as child labor, forced labor, excessive working hours, etc., rather than having a responsive and less effective approach. Human rights due diligence, or HRDD, supports companies in delivering their no exploitation commitments in the NDPE policy. Human rights due diligence, or HRDD, is defined by the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, also known as the UNGPs. The UNGPs clarified the role companies have in respecting human rights and what a company should do to conduct itself responsibly. This consists of having a commitment to respect internationally recognized human rights. This commitment exists over and above compliance with national laws. Establish an effective system to ensure that the commitment is fulfilled through the HRDD process. HRDD is an ongoing management process that a company needs to implement in order to identify, prevent, mitigate, and account for how companies address their adverse human rights impacts. And have a process to enable remediation when harm happens. Remediation is about putting right any actual human rights impact that occurred, which translates into remediate harm when caused or contributed to as swiftly as possible. Use or increase leverage to have the third party that caused or contributed to the harm remediated. Have or participate in an operational level grievance mechanism to address complaints and disputes, which is trusted by the relevant stakeholders and allows issues to be caught early. Let's now have a closer look at the human rights due diligence process. Looking at this diagram, you may find similarities with other management processes, but what is unique about HRDD is that risks to people are at the center of this approach. So it's shifting from risks to business, considered in traditional materiality assessments, to the rights holders that business operations may put at risk. To understand risks and impacts, as well as to find solutions on how to address issues and monitor that the actions taken are being effective in increasing the enjoyment of people's rights, a company should consult with stakeholders. Another key aspect of human rights due diligence is embedding human rights into decisions, departments, systems, and governance a company has. Now let's look more closely at the 4 steps of this approach. The first step is to identify actual and potential adverse human rights impacts. This is generally done through human rights risk assessments. Once the company knows its risks and impacts, then it will need to act upon the findings and embed human rights considerations into existing processes to prevent or mitigate the occurrence of harm. Tracking is about understanding the effectiveness of the actions taken, to understand if human rights impacts are being addressed. This may include quantitative and qualitative indicators, draw on internal and external sources, including effective rights holders. Finally, a company should communicate to stakeholders how risks and impacts are being addressed, remediated, and how effective the actions are. Traceability through supply chain mapping to production is an enabling element for human rights due diligence, as it provides targeted information to identify, monitor, and address the risks and how they're related to the impacts. HRDD is an approach that every company, no matter its size or operating context, can implement. But it can involve different actions for companies depending which position in the supply chain a company has. The closer a company is to the site of production, the more steps of HRDD are likely to involve direct engagement with affected people. For example, the closer to production a company is, the more stakeholder engagement would mean engaging directly with production-level rights holders themselves. While for a downstream company, engagement may be through proxies, such as civil society organizations. Similarly, for upstream companies, communication and reporting on impacts will be tailored to affected rights holders, as well as to other stakeholders. While for downstream companies, consumers, as well as other stakeholders, will be an important audience for reporting. If we look at risk assessments at operational level, those are likely to include fieldwork and engagement with rights holders. While when conducting risk assessments for a commodity produced across several countries, desk-based research and consultation with representatives of stakeholder groups, such as trade unions and NGOs, is more likely. If we look at some examples of actions that a downstream company could take to address and embed human rights in responsible sourcing, this could include including human rights in supplier screening, onboarding, and engagement, using or increasing its leverage with suppliers to stop, mitigate, and remediate human rights abuses through incentives, capacity building, contracts, and sourcing decisions. Whereas examples of actions for an upstream company to address and embed in its own operations, like mills and plantations, could include developing an action plan with clear timeline, responsibility, and KPIs to mitigate and prevent abuses, strengthening recruitment practices to prevent migrant workers paying recruitment fees, or a standard operating procedure on free, prior, and informed consent to align with its best practice. If you want to know more about human rights due diligence, please visit the Human Rights Due Diligence Library of Tools on the Palmwell Collaboration Group website, where you can find resources, self-assessments, and tools to get you started on HRDD.